At the time of writing this story, I was 21 years old, a woman, and I grew up in Ohio. This was one of the most terrifying nights of my life, and I'm still afraid to drive alone at night. When I wrote this, I was in the middle of moving with my family from a well-known suburb just outside a major city to a small farming town. My parents were never city people. They both grew up on farms down south, and our family had lived in similar rural places until I was about to start high school. So you can imagine how eager they were to get back to their roots. I'm the youngest of 4 kids with 3 older brothers. I was the last one to graduate. So the summer after my senior year, my parents decided it was the perfect chance to switch things up, since I wasn't tied to a school district anymore. The town we were moving to was only about 45 minutes away. Instead of hauling everything over at once and overwhelming ourselves, my parents opted to move our stuff bit by bit over 2 or 3 weeks, hoping it'd help us settle into the new place more smoothly. Most of the drive between the 2 towns was along major highways, pretty straightforward, which is why that night was so terrifying. I'd made this trip nearly 50 times before, so I was way too comfortable and let my guard down. I'm a pretty small girl, about 5'3" and 140 pounds. Even though my dad taught me self-defense when I was younger, I'm the type who freezes up in a confrontation or under pressure. It's frustrating, so it's honestly a miracle I got out of this alive. One night I decided to swing by and visit some old friends in the neighborhood we were leaving. I'd stopped there on my way back to our new house. I don't remember the exact time, maybe 10 or 11 p.m., but it was definitely dark out. Though Ohio's a northern state with harsh winters, the summers lately have been sweltering, even at night. I sometimes get carsick in the heat, especially with all that humid air trapped in the car. My AC was acting up, so I usually drove home with the windows down. As I said, it was late, and there weren't many cars on the road with me. I'd seen maybe 10 the whole trip. About halfway through on the second major highway, there's an intersection with a gas station on my right and nothing but a river and a bridge on my left. It's a 4-lane highway, and I was in the far right lane because of a turn I'd need to make further down. That might sound like useless detail, but it'll matter later. Nothing seemed off at first. Like I said, I'd done this drive plenty of times. I pulled up to a red light at the intersection, playing some pop-punk music with my left arm hanging out the driver's side window. Then another car rolled up in the lane to my left. Looking back, it might have been a Dodge Charger, bright orange with a thick black stripe across the top. I was singing along to whatever song was on when I heard voices next to me. They weren't quiet, and since I have ADHD, the noise made me turn my head. I regretted it instantly. When I glanced over, I saw a guy leaning out of the passenger side window, staring right at me with a grin that made my stomach churn. It was obvious he'd been talking to me. I whipped my head back around, knowing that if I held eye contact any longer, he might think I wanted to chat. Then I heard a hand slap their car door, clearly one of the guys trying to get my attention. Amid all this, the front passenger started whistling, that classic catcall whistle so many girls hear walking down the street. I was getting mad. I'm not a dog, but I kept staring ahead, praying for the light to change so I could get away from these creeps. This might sound ridiculous since we were still at the red light, but this particular traffic signal had old, finicky sensors. You'd have to back up and pull forward just to trigger it sometimes. I hadn't given these guys any sign I wanted to talk, but apparently, that only egged them on. The front passenger and 2 other voices piped up, "Hey, sweetheart, need a ride? Why don't you hop in? We'll show you a good time tonight. Meet us at the gas station. We won't hurt you. Come on, talk to us. We just want to get to know you." I'd had enough. I rolled up my window and locked my doors. That obviously ticked off the front passenger because just before the window shut, I heard him yell something and then fling his door open. Before I knew it, he was out of the car and at my back passenger door, yanking on the handle. This is why the lane detail matters. I was basically trapped. If I tried to get out and run to the gas station, God forbid I'd have to sprint across the bridge on my left. I'd have to get past their car and this guy. Obviously, jumping out and running wasn't my best bet, but I was terrified and trying to weigh my options. Looking back, I know now that would have been the moment to bolt, but I was paralyzed with fear. Confrontation freaks me out. I couldn't even feel my legs to hit the gas, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so tight I couldn't feel them either. The guy quickly realized he couldn't get in and moved to my window, pounding on it with an open hand. He hit it so hard I swear I heard the glass creak like it might shatter any second. When I still wouldn't look at him, he stopped long enough to spit all over my window. I don't know what gave me the strength. Maybe the thought that he might break the glass and get inside. But as he raised his arm again, looking like he was about to slam his elbow into it, I ran the red light, definitely speeding, just to get out of there. I don't know what made me glance back, but when I peeked in my rearview mirror, I saw all three guys standing outside their car. One of them was holding something small. Honestly, I don't even want to think about what it was. I nearly threw up from nerves and cried the whole way home. My parents own a restaurant in the area and often work late, so when I got back, only one of my brothers, Milo, was there. He did his best to calm me down, but I don't think I slept at all that night. I know it's irrational to be scared since those guys didn't follow me home, but I locked my bedroom door anyway just to feel a little safer. I regret not getting their license plate, but as you can probably tell, I was shaken up and just wanted to get out of there. I've never had another encounter like that in the area, but I'll admit I found an alternate route through some back roads. I mostly avoid that highway now. This is a story my dad shared with me. He grew up in a small town called Stowe, Ohio, with his parents and older sister. Across the street lived a boy named Tommy, about the same age as my dad. He described Tommy as a scrawny, red-haired troublemaker. The kid would spit on people as they walked by and even set fire to a house in the neighborhood, only to pin the blame on a child with special needs. But nothing Tommy did as a kid could compare to the crimes he'd commit by the time he was 19. My dad had just started his sophomore year of college when he heard the news. Tommy, along with his friends Marcus and Lyle, had been throwing rocks off a local bridge onto the interstate below. One of those rocks smashed into the car of Mindy Harper, a 21-year-old, while her friend Tim Novak, 20, was with her. They were siblings from the Soar family, just getting off work. Lyle decided he'd had enough and headed home, but that's when Tommy and Marcus hatched their twisted plan. The two young men approached the girls, offering to help and drive them to a nearby shopping center where they could call their parents. Instead, Tommy and Marcus tied their hands and took them to a field behind the mall. There, the girls were assaulted and tortured for 3 grueling hours. Afterward, the pair left their bodies in the field. Not content with that, they decided to sell the girls' clothes and jewelry for extra cash. When Tommy couldn't find a buyer, he burned the items in his backyard, waking up my grandparents in the process. My grandpa called the police, thinking it was just another one of Tommy's neighborhood disturbances. The police gathered evidence, and after finding Mindy's abandoned car, they arrested Tommy and launched an investigation. Both he and Marcus were soon apprehended and charged with murder. They found the knife used in the killings in Marcus's pocket when he was caught, and some of the burned items still had traces of the victim's DNA. Since Marcus was only 17, he escaped the death penalty and is now serving a life sentence in prison. Tommy, though, was sentenced to death. On October 14, 2003 at 10 a.m., Thomas Wade Kelly was executed by lethal injection. Mindy's family was there to witness it. Every time I visit my grandparents' house, I look across the street where Tommy used to live, and I can't help but shudder. I'm glad I never met him, and I'm thankful my dad was smart enough to steer clear of him growing up. This happened back in 2011, around February. English is my second language, so bear with me if I stumble a bit. I'm a 33-year-old Haitian man, living on the outskirts of London now. At the time, I was 20 and still living with my parents. I was dating my first girlfriend, who I'll call Nadine. She was 19, and the first 6 months of our relationship were great. We had a lot in common. Nadine originally came from Martinique, a small island in the Caribbean where a lot of people speak French, just like I do. She lived with her brother and 2 male cousins. I thought I'd found my soulmate, but sadly I was wrong. As our relationship went on, she started getting more and more controlling. She'd constantly argue with me and yell in my face if she found out I'd been playing online video games with my longtime female friends. She even tried to fight one of them once because she thought I was cheating. My friend got the upper hand, of course, and that was that. Eventually, I'd had enough and broke up with her. I kicked her out of my life for good. But about a month after the breakup, things started getting weird. I'd begun dating the girl who'd later become my wife. Let's call her Justine. When Nadine found out I was seeing someone new, she lost it. She started calling me nonstop and sending me threatening emails. Her brother even left me some seriously disturbing voicemails. "You bastard. You're going to suffer for hurting my sister's feelings. I know where you live and I'm coming for you." Justine was worried, but I didn't think much would come of it. Once again, I was dead wrong. One night, my parents were out, so Justine and I were alone, just enjoying ourselves. Then we heard someone pounding on the front door, not like a knock, but like they were trying to break it down. "I told you I'd come for you, didn't I? I'm going to kill you. You never should have hurt my sister, and now you're going to pay." I recognized the man's voice instantly. It was Nadine's brother. We bolted upstairs to my bedroom. Soon enough, we heard the lunatic downstairs smash through the front door and start storming inside. Then we heard more people rushing into the house, followed by a commotion. We locked ourselves in the bedroom and called the police. They showed up in less than a minute. Turns out the other people who ran in were our next-door neighbors. They'd seen what was happening and decided to step in. The police found a big kitchen knife in the guy's backpack. Both my ex and her unhinged brother were arrested for attempted murder. Now you might be thinking, attempted murder? The guy was clearly planning to kill you both. But this is the UK. The justice system here is a complete mess. Still, Nadine and her crazy brother were deported back to Martinique. The only problem? Martinique is a French territory, so they could easily hop over to France and sneak back into London from there. Justine and I moved on with our lives, and we're married now. I just hope Nadine and her psycho brother don't try to track us down again. I'm a 27-year-old guy who spent about a year in San Francisco for work. While I loved living in the Bay Area, the cost of living was insanely high, and being so far from friends and family made it tough to settle down long term. So I was thrilled to head back to my home state of Louisiana. I finally landed a job near my hometown that suited me better and kept me closer to my loved ones. After quitting my job, I quickly packed up my stuff, loaded the car, and started the 2,000-mile journey back home. Since my workdays in California were long and draining, I hadn't had much time to explore the beautiful state, so I decided to make the most of the trip and visit some scenic spots along the way. I met up with friends in Southern California and checked out the beaches in Los Angeles and San Diego. After a couple of days, I hit the road again. I stopped at a rest area in Arizona to fill up the gas tank and grab some lunch. While walking back from the restroom, I noticed an old beat-up truck in the parking lot. It was white with random red and blue streaks on it. A man was sitting in the driver's seat smoking. He looked rough, like the kind of guy you'd see begging outside a gas station. As I passed by, he grinned and waved at me. Instantly, I felt an uneasy knot in my chest that sank into my stomach. I gave him a quick nod and kept moving, then jumped in my car and drove off. That night, I stopped at a hotel in Tucson to rest. After checking in, I went back to my car to grab some things and immediately spotted an old truck in the hotel parking lot that looked eerily similar to the one from the rest area. At first, I brushed it off as just another creepy old truck, but then I noticed the red and blue streaks on the side. They weren't a deliberate design, more like the truck had been parked near some sloppy painters. This had to be the same truck I'd seen earlier. I figured maybe it was a weird coincidence, that the guy was just traveling in the same direction as me. I hurried back to my hotel room to crash for the night. The next morning when I went to my car, I glanced at the parking lot. The truck was gone. I let out a sigh of relief and continued my journey. I decided to stop in Albuquerque to explore a bit. There was a festival happening downtown, so I wandered around enjoying the live music. While waiting in line at one of the food trucks, I got that strange feeling you get when something's off. I looked up and saw a man about 200 feet away staring at me. He was leaning against a tree smoking. It was the same guy from the rest area. I started walking toward him to get a better look, but he slipped into the crowd and vanished. I was stunned. This wasn't a random coincidence anymore. This man was following me. I bolted back to my car and drove off. Later, I called my parents from the highway and told my dad about the guy tailing me. He brushed it off, saying lots of people travel the same route and stop in the same cities. "You're probably just paranoid," he said. My mom, on the other hand, sounded more concerned. "Please stay aware of your surroundings and keep your phone charged," she urged. They both suggested I stop at my brother's place in Dallas, instead of driving straight through to Louisiana. I drove another 6 hours, and as it got dark, I was exhausted. I pulled into a rest area along a rural road to rest. It was remote with barely any light. I was so tired I actually nodded off at the wheel after parking. I jolted awake to a loud bang on my driver's side window. I turned to my left and saw someone standing there. It was pitch dark and I couldn't make out who it was at first. I flicked on the overhead light and there he was, the same man. Then I saw that beat-up white truck parked right next to me. My heart started racing. He grinned at me and motioned for me to roll down the window. "I need help. Roll it down. Now," he said. I shook my head and said, "No." His face twisted with anger, and he started pounding on the window. He grabbed the door handle, but thankfully, I'd locked everything tight. Then he pulled out a knife and snarled, "Open the damn door!" I started the car, threw it into reverse, and peeled out. He chased after me with the knife in his hand. I couldn't stop gasping for air. I was on the verge of a panic attack, but I sped out of the rest area and back onto the highway. I called my parents again and told them what had just happened. They were floored. No one could call this a coincidence anymore. They agreed it was worth calling the police, though they doubted much could be done since the rest area was in the middle of nowhere, likely with no cameras in the lot. I was about 5 hours from my brother's place. My parents urged me to stop at the nearest big city, about an hour away, and spend the night in a hotel. The next day, I finally got in touch with the police and filed a report. I gave them the rest area's location and a description of the truck. They passed it along to highway patrol, but as expected, there wasn't much they could do. The guy was probably miles away by then. They strongly advised me to stick to main roads and avoid driving at night. I made it to Dallas and told my brother and sister-in-law everything. My brother, a true Texan who loves his guns, said he'd keep a weapon ready just in case. I stayed in Dallas for about a week before driving home to Louisiana. Thankfully, I never saw that man again. Since that terrifying experience, I've avoided long solo road trips, and I'm almost always nervous driving through rural areas. It's way too easy to disappear without a trace in places like that. What haunts me most is that a random stranger relentlessly followed me for miles, from Arizona to Texas over 2 days. I keep wondering what his intentions were, and what would have happened if I hadn't escaped that rest area. This story happened when I was 17, and I'm 20 now, so it was about 3 years ago. It was a late summer night, and I had just finished my shift as a retail worker at the local Walmart. I know it's not the greatest job out there, but back then for my first job at 17, it was decent enough. When I got to the bus stop, I pulled out my phone to track the bus and saw it was delayed by 2 hours. Obviously, that annoyed me because I needed to get home and sleep for school the next morning. There was no way I was waiting 2 hours for a bus, so I decided to take a different route home by walking. At the time, I didn't realize it, but this turned out to be a bad decision. You'll see why later. My neighborhood was about a 20 to 30-minute walk away, so I figured I'd give it a shot and started heading home. The area was pretty quiet at night, with hardly any cars on the streets. As I walked up the road, I was listening to music through my earbuds, just passing the time. At first, I heard an engine noise not too far behind me. I thought it was just my music playing tricks on me, but after pulling out my earbuds, I realized that wasn't the case. About 20 feet away, a pair of headlights was creeping closer. Without thinking much of it, I turned back to my music. Eventually, the car pulled up beside me. Now, as a girl planning to major in mechanical engineering, I could tell the make and model. It was a 2004 Honda Accord. Inside was a man I'd never seen before, waving at me. I waved back politely, just to be nice, and then he gestured for me to take out my earbuds. When I did, he started asking me what my name was and if I knew where Water Creek was. I've lived in my city my whole life, and I'd never heard of a place called Water Creek. I assumed it was some random neighborhood, so I apologized and told him I didn't know where it was and that my name was Mara. There was a long pause after I said that, until he asked for directions to another area I didn't recognize. By then, I just wanted to get home and didn't feel like talking anymore. I lied and told him to go straight and turn left twice until he hit the highway. He paused, looking confused, and then asked if I could get in the car to show him the way. He even offered to pay for an Uber to get me back home. I politely declined, saying I had a curfew and needed to get home. But he kept pushing, asking again if I'd get in the car with him. I said no a second time and started walking faster, hoping he'd take the hint. Luckily, he did. He mumbled something like, "Good night, Mara," and drove off. I made it home safely, though not without my mom scolding me for being out so late and not calling her. My mom's not a night owl. She goes to bed early, which is why I didn't call her to pick me up. I gave her my usual apologies and went upstairs to crash. That's when things started getting really weird. I'd been asleep for a few hours when I woke up to a strange noise outside. I checked my phone. It was around 3:30 a.m. I sighed to myself, wondering what had jolted me awake. Then I looked out my window and saw that all too familiar Honda Accord parked nearby, with someone standing below my window. "Hey Mara, you up there? Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." I screamed at the top of my lungs, which sent my mom bursting into my room in a panic. Let me just say, my mom's a former military woman. She doesn't mess around. When she came in, she was on high alert. I managed to stammer out that there was a man on our property who'd followed me. Her face turned stone cold serious as she flung open the window and started yelling at him to back off or she'd end him. My mom's tough as nails and doesn't make empty threats, so when I saw he wasn't budging, I got chills. Why? My dad wasn't home is a whole other complicated story not worth getting into. The guy just stood there on our lawn, staring up at the window like he was waiting for one of us to come down. Then I saw my mom dash to her room only to come back with a handgun. She straight up pulled the gun, aimed it out the window at him, and started counting to 3. That's when he finally got in his car and peeled out. Honestly, he probably thought she was bluffing when she threatened him. That's why he didn't leave sooner. I hugged my mom tight after that, and we called the police. They patrolled the area looking for him, but unfortunately they didn't have any luck. I wasn't sure what his motives were, and I really didn't want to know, but I found out not long after. A few days later, we got word that a girl, just a little older than me, had gone missing in the area. She was found dead in a field about 5 miles from where she was last seen. The local news covered it, and when we saw the guy responsible, I nearly threw up. Yep, you guessed it. It was the same man who tried to lure me into his car, the same one who showed up at my house that night. Thankfully, he was caught and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Some say his family posted his $100,000 bail, but that's never been confirmed or denied. I really hope he's still locked up, and if he's not, I hope he's suffering somehow. This world is seriously messed up. This story is told from a woman's perspective. All of this happened when I was around 16 or 17 years old. I lived in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and I was always taught about the dangers of grown-ups with bad intentions. I was well aware of it, but honestly I didn't pay much attention because I had this mindset that it would never happen to me. I know now how wrong I was. It was the summer of 2016, and I had just gotten home from school when I got a text from my best friend inviting me to a party. I had a ton of homework to do, but since it was Friday night and the weekend was right around the corner, I told her I'd come hang out. My mom, who was really close to me and someone I cherished, dropped me off that night. She told me to have fun but to stay alert and not go home with anyone. I didn't think much of her warning as usual. I met up with my friend, I'll call her Naomi, who introduced me to some of her other friends. A few hours later, we were all partying and generally having a good time. But then I started to feel how tired I was. Obviously, I didn't want to crash at the party, so I told Naomi I was going to head home to get some sleep. Being the good friend she was, she offered to drive me, but for some reason, I turned her down, telling her I'd be fine. Looking back, that was the one thing I absolutely shouldn't have done. I thanked her for inviting me and started walking home with my hoodie pulled up, reflecting on life like I always do whenever I get a moment alone. For some reason, those quiet times always brought me peace. It was around 2 a.m., and there were hardly any cars on the street, which was pretty unusual since it was a big residential area. I was about halfway home when I spotted a bus stop up ahead. There was a middle-aged woman sitting on the bench dressed in a nightgown, holding a crying baby wrapped in a blanket. I noticed her, but I didn't really get a good look because of the blanket. She saw me and started practically begging me for money to feed her kid. As a broke high school kid with no job, I apologized and told her I didn't have any money. That didn't seem to sit well with her. She ignored what I said and kept asking, saying things like her baby was sick, needed food, and so on. I apologized again and told her no. As I tried to walk away, I noticed something off about the way the baby was crying. It sounded strange, but I couldn't figure out why at first. Then, after a few seconds, it hit me, and a chill ran down my spine. The crying was looping, the same sob, scream, and whimper over and over. It didn't take long for me to realize it was coming from a speaker. There probably wasn't even a real baby. The woman must have caught on to my suspicion because she was staring at me now with this blank, eerie expression. I told her I'd actually forgotten my wallet at home and said I'd go grab it and come back. Then I bolted back toward the party, praying to God that no one was following me. I finally told Naomi what happened, and I stayed at the party until my mom came to pick me up. She scolded me for being so careless, but I was just grateful to be safe. The authorities were called, but I don't remember if they ever found the woman. To this day, I still don't know what her intentions were. Most likely nothing good. That was probably the scariest moment of my life, and it's why I never walk home alone at night anymore. This happened back in 2017 when I was a junior in college, living in a small town in eastern Massachusetts. It was a bit of a trek from my place to campus, so I often had to take the train to get to school and back home when my parents were around. Usually they'd give me a ride, but when they weren't home, the train was my go-to. Owning a car was too expensive, and Uber felt like a hassle. I'd take the train to school during the day and head back home at night. Growing up, I always had this initial unease about the dark. Not exactly a fear of the night itself, but of what might be lurking in it. I never had anything solid to pin that fear on until one night when I got off at the station and saw a woman sitting alone on a bench. It was odd because it was almost 1 a.m. on a school night, which meant no more. Trains would be running until the next day. For some reason, I glanced over at her and our eyes met briefly. But by then it was too late. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see her stand up and start hurrying toward me, acting like I hadn't noticed or didn't care. I'd called an Uber to get home, and as she approached, she stopped about 3 feet away from me. I gave her a small smile, and she just stared back with this blank expression like she was doing something mundane, taking out the trash or mowing the lawn. In the flattest tone I'd ever heard, she said, "Hi, my car broke down. Can you help me fix it?" First off, there wasn't a single car in the nearby parking lot. Second, if she had a car, why was she waiting at a train station? It struck me as strange, but I didn't feel threatened or scared. I apologized and told her I couldn't help because I had a curfew and needed to get home. She didn't seem to care about what I said, though, and kept insisting I help her. Being a guy studying engineering, I might have tried if there'd actually been a car, but since there wasn't, I was at a loss. I asked her about it, hoping she'd give me some explanation. Instead of answering with a reason, she said something that still haunts me to this day. "Come on, Milo, don't bother me with details." Then she flashed this creepy smile, like something out of a nightmare, that chilled me to the bone. She turned back to the bench, sat down, and started rearranging her things as if nothing had happened. Milo's my name, and I had no idea how she knew it. I'd never seen this woman before in my life, and I wasn't wearing anything that could have shown my name. Luckily, my Uber pulled up right then, and I got home safe. That weekend, I woke up to over 10 missed calls and messages from different numbers, everything from "Hi, how are you" to "I'll find you." I knew there was a good chance it was tied to that night. 2 weird things like that don't happen so close together without some kind of connection. I never saw that woman again, and I stopped taking the train at night after that. This happened when I was a junior in college, around 19 or 20 years old, and I'd almost forgotten about it until my dad brought it up recently. I don't recall the story in vivid detail, but I definitely remember what happened and how it unfolded. I figured I'd share it. I lived in a row house, or for those who aren't familiar, it's a bunch of houses mashed together. At the end of my street, there was a small shopping center that turned out to be pretty popular in my area. It had a mix of shops, restaurants, and a grocery store where I worked while I was a full-time student. I only worked part-time at the store, so I was there on weekends. Weekends were probably the busiest days since a lot of people were off work, and grocery shopping is one of those essential errands. I know this might sound controversial, but I actually liked my job. I was in charge of stocking items in their proper places, which made the time pass quickly for me. Sure, you'd occasionally deal with entitled customers or the odd complainer, but that was rare. One day, though, one of my managers called me during the week and asked if I could come in because they were short-staffed. I'd just finished class around that time, and while I didn't really want to, it meant extra cash in my pocket by the end of the day. So I agreed and took someone else's shift. It was a 6-hour shift, and we closed at 11 p.m., which meant I'd be working pretty late. That annoyed me because I had a 7 a.m. class, so I wouldn't get much sleep. Still, I told myself it was just a one-off, and the time would fly by. Fast forward to around 10:30 p.m. The store was almost closed, and I was at the produce section stocking the last few items. As I was working, my manager called me over and told me to go collect the shopping carts left out in the parking lot. I hated doing that. The carts were heavy and I wasn't exactly strong, but I sucked it up and went outside to gather them. While I was bringing them back to the store, I heard someone call out to me from the parking lot. I turned around, and as I walked halfway across the lot, I saw a guy heading toward me with a backpack. He looked like he was in his mid-20s, wearing a cap, and seemed like your average college student. He came up near the store, and I asked if I could help him with anything. He asked if we were still open and if he could grab a few things. Of course, I said yes and handed him one of the shopping cards I had, telling him he could use it. He gave me this blank stare, nodded, then took off his backpack and asked if I could hold it for him. I hesitated a bit. I wasn't sure about taking it, but I couldn't really say no. I told him I'd hold it. The moment he handed me the bag, he pulled out a gun, pressed it against my neck, and put a finger to his lips. "If you scream, I'll shoot. Come with me and don't say a word." My entire world shrank and froze in that instant. Fear doesn't even begin to describe what I felt. I was petrified, too terrified to make a sound or even cry. He slowly started walking me toward his car, still pointing the gun at me. My mind flooded with thoughts and scenarios. Where was he taking me? What was going to happen? I didn't know, and honestly, I was too horrified to care. He opened the trunk and told me to get in, warning me not to try running. Obviously, I complied and climbed into the trunk. Then out of nowhere, I heard my manager yelling at the guy from across the parking lot. He was sprinting toward the car. I seized that moment to bolt from the trunk, praying to God the guy wouldn't shoot. Or if he did, that he'd miss. I should mention my manager, let's call him Marcus, was a big guy. When the stranger saw him coming, he jumped into his car and floored it. I practically threw myself into Marcus's arms, sobbing uncontrollably as he comforted me and asked if I was okay. I could barely string a coherent sentence together and just tried to explain what had happened. We made it back inside the store, and he immediately called 911 while sitting me down in the back office. The whole time I just stared blankly ahead as we waited for the police. Luckily, my city's police department was quick to respond, so they got there fast. By then, I'd calmed down a little. The officers asked me a few questions about the guy I'd seen, and I described him as best I could. That's when they called my parents to come pick me up. They were frantic, but thanked the police and Marcus for acting so quickly. I took a week off from school and work after that. Marcus never made me go out to collect carts at night again, though it was terrifying. He apologized to me for letting me go out there alone at night. I didn't see why he needed to apologize, but I accepted it. A few weeks later, I was back to my regular weekend shifts. The police investigated and eventually tracked down the guy who'd tried to kidnap me. The gun he'd pointed at me was apparently fake, though that's never been fully confirmed or denied to this day. I still get chills thinking about it, and I never go out alone at night anymore. I hope you can use my story as a reminder that there really are some awful, twisted people out there in the world. So here's what happened to me when I was about 18 years old. I had just landed my first real paying job at a grocery store back in my hometown of Greenville, North Carolina. To give you some context, this took place on Halloween night in 2005, and I was wrapping up my shift because, well, it was Halloween. The store was pretty much closed except for a few late-night customers grabbing some last-minute candy. Anyway, we had about 30 minutes left before locking up, and my assistant manager, Marcus, told me to count the cash and that I could head home afterward. He'd handle closing up. Marcus was hands down the best boss you could ask for. He genuinely cared about his employees and always pushed you to do better. I finished counting my register, and that's when it all went down. We heard the front door swing open, and in walked 4 guys wearing masks, pointing guns at us and yelling for us to get down. It was just me, Marcus, and another coworker, Tina, in the store, so we all hit the floor, hands up. One of the guys stormed over to Marcus, pressed a gun to his head, and demanded all the money we had in the registers. Cool as anything, Marcus told me to unlock all the cash drawers and give them whatever was inside. Then another one of the guys came up to me, barking at me to hurry up and open the register as I fumbled for the keys. I was so shaken that my hands started trembling and I could barely get the key in. To make matters worse, the damn key wouldn't open the drawer no matter how many times I tried. The lock mechanism on that register was busted. It was always a pain to lock or unlock, and that just pissed the guy off even more. He started threatening me, saying I'd better get it open fast. After about a minute of struggling, the drawer finally popped open, and I let out a huge sigh of relief. The guy pulled out a bag and gleefully scooped up the cash, about $800 in total. Then they used that key to unlock the rest of the registers, grabbed everything they could, and bolted out the door, jumping into what we assumed was their getaway car. I think we were all just frozen in shock for a few minutes before we got up, trying to process what the hell had just happened. Marcus, being the stand-up guy he was, told everyone to stay calm and said he'd call the cops. The police showed up, took a report, and even reviewed the footage from the store's cameras. But since it was 2005, the camera quality was pretty awful, and on top of that, we didn't exactly have top-notch security. The way those guys were dressed and how they operated led us to guess they might have been part of some mafia crew or something. Pure speculation, of course. I don't know if that's true, but, I grew up in a small kind of rural town where stuff like this just didn't happen. When crime did pop up, it was usually petty stuff, nothing big. That night I learned the hard way that no one's really safe at the end of the day. It's probably a lot more dangerous out there than you think. I sure as hell found that out, firsthand. The scariest part, though? If I'd taken even one more minute to get that register open, I might not be sitting here writing this today. When I was just over 30, I worked as a truck driver in the transportation industry, hailing from West Virginia. Sometimes we'd spend long stretches on the road, and if the job gave us half the time to ourselves, we could do whatever we wanted with that free time. But when we were driving, we had to stick to a strict schedule and get to our destinations on time. Though it might seem like an easygoing gig, it could get pretty stressful at times. After driving for over 11 hours a day for more than 4 years, as a trucker, I've definitely had my share of weird experiences on the road. These ranged from oddball delivery folks to a few obviously drunk people wandering around. Nothing too dangerous ever happened, thankfully. But there was this one time I saw something completely unexplainable on one of my runs. If I remember right, it was a Tuesday night, and I was doing my usual 10-hour haul to deliver some goods to a facility. I was cruising down this long stretch of road somewhere in Ohio, a route that cut across the state with dense forest lining, both sides. I mostly worked shifts near woodland areas, so driving on roads like this wasn't anything new to me. Surprisingly, this particular road was dead quiet, no other vehicles in sight. which made the trip feel oddly peaceful. It was around 4 a.m., and I was about halfway to my drop-off point when, out of nowhere, a red rubber ball bounced across the road in front of my truck coming from the woods. I slammed on the brakes, yelling out a loud, "Damn it," as I came to a full stop. When I stopped the truck, my mind started racing about what the hell I'd just seen and what I should do next. I was 99% sure there had to be a kid playing around out there, so I got out of the cab, ready to give whoever it was a piece of my mind. But when I stepped outside, the road was completely empty. It looked like I was the only soul around for miles, no one nearby who could have tossed that ball. Then it hit me. I remembered exactly where the ball had come from and where I was at that moment. It had flown out of the forest, meaning someone in there had to have thrown it. And there was no way I was sticking around to find out who. Keep in mind, I was nowhere near the closest town. There weren't any houses for miles around. I hopped back in my truck and peeled out of there, my head spinning with questions and wild scenarios. At that point, I wasn't sure if it was a kid who'd thrown the ball or if someone had done it on purpose to lure me out. Maybe to set me up for something sketchy. That thought still gives me chills whenever it crosses my mind. As I sped off, I could have sworn I saw a figure step out from the tree line and onto the road. It didn't look like a kid, and it sure as hell wasn't an animal. It was too dark to make out their face or features. Just a tall, shadowy silhouette standing smack in the middle of the road. That's the gist of it. I finished my shift that night and told the story to some of the other truckers. A couple of them even said they'd had similar weird run-ins on that same route. I've had a few other strange encounters over the years, but that one takes the cake for some reason. It's stuck with me all this time, haunting me whenever I'm behind the wheel because it's something I just can't shake. I always wonder, what would have happened if I'd gone into those woods to look for whoever was out there? One thing's for damn sure, I've never taken that route again. This happened about 5 years ago when I was working as a truck driver for an independent contractor. It was a really well-paying job. I made enough to support myself and my family financially, with great wages and benefits. But there were times when we truckers had to face and deal with things we didn't want to. A lot of it involved rude people you'd run into, long hours of non-stop driving, and plenty of stress. This particular incident happened in the winter of 2018, around 8 p.m. I'd been assigned a specific route to deliver some manufactured goods to car dealerships in isolated areas, small towns, counties, and tiny settlements far from any big cities. These were rural parts of the state that needed supplies, and that's what I usually did most of the time. Anyway, I was driving along, trying my best to be careful because the roads were uneven and icy. It was snowing heavily out there, and I wasn't planning on flipping the truck halfway through. I noticed the fuel tank was getting low, so I eventually had to stop for gas. Luckily, there were a few truck stops along these roads, so it wouldn't be too hard to refuel. About 20 minutes later, I pulled into a truck stop, got out, and headed to the fuel pump. Now, every truck driver gets a company-issued fuel card. It's basically used to pay for gas. While I was waiting, I saw a guy wandering around a small building to my left. He was pacing back and forth, staring up at the sky with his hands in his pockets. He didn't say a word, just looked like someone deep in thought or brainstorming ideas. I didn't think much of it and focused on my phone while waiting for the truck to fill up. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him stop and slowly start walking toward me. He didn't look like a trucker or an employee, more like someone you'd assume was homeless. This stop was practically in the middle of nowhere, so there was no real reason for him to be out here. He came up to me and asked for money in a pretty demanding way. I told him I was in a hurry and needed to get back on the road, hoping he'd take the hint, but it didn't seem to work. He kept insisting I give him cash. Being a decent guy, I handed him a $5 bill, just hoping he'd take it and leave. Thankfully, that seemed to do the trick. He went into the store and came out with a pack of cigarettes. It was annoying, but the truck was almost ready and I could get going soon. Once the tank was full, I decided to grab a quick cup of coffee from the store to keep myself awake. When I got back, the guy was nowhere to be seen, but I didn't care much. I hopped into the truck, pulled out of the stop, and got back on the road. I'll say this. Right then, I started feeling really tired, even while sipping the coffee. Still, the destination was only an hour away, so I figured I'd make it in time. Fast forward about half an hour, I'm still driving, just wanting my shift to end when I felt a cold hand grab my face from behind. It made me swerve off the road and crash into the snow. I managed to get out, dragged the guy out of the truck, and from what I told the police later, the fight was over in seconds. I landed a few punches to his head. He got up, but instead of fighting back, he just ran off in the opposite direction and disappeared into the snow. I took that chance to get back in and haul ass down the road. Luckily, I made it to the drop-off point where I called the cops. The only problem was that the road I'd been on was in the middle of nowhere, so the chances of finding him again were slim to none. I kept driving trucks for another 2 years after that, then moved on to work on an oil rig. I can say I've never experienced anything like that again, but as far as I know, these kinds of incidents aren't rare for truckers. I've heard some stories from other drivers that'd make you never want to leave your house. Anyway, that's my story, and I hope it teaches you to stay aware of your surroundings. Back in 2014, my family and I decided to move from our old apartment in Brooklyn to the rolling hills of Tennessee. According to my parents, life there was supposed to be so much easier. They'd grown tired of the city, and as they got older, they felt more and more drawn to the quiet of rural suburbs. At the time, plane tickets were at an all-time high, and we didn't have much money to spare. Because of that, my parents figured we'd drive from New York all the way to Tennessee. Instead, it was a long haul, but considering all the road trips we'd taken over the years, it seemed doable enough. We packed everything up and set out on the 15-hour drive to Gatlinburg, about 4 hours from Nashville. It was a grueling trip, but we'd made it halfway, and there was no way we were turning back. If I remember right, we were driving down some stretch of road, somewhere in Kentucky or West Virginia, I think, that cut through the middle of the state. It was around 1 a.m., and I woke up just as I felt the car slowing to a stop. Rubbing my eyes, I asked my dad, Marcus, why we'd pulled over. That's when I noticed something, or someone, lying in the middle of the road. From where I was, it looked like a woman, maybe in her 40s, with dark hair, wearing what seemed to be a sweater. My parents were instantly thrown off. My mom, Lena, and I watched as Marcus, a former soldier, told us to stay in the car. His instincts always kicked in during moments like this, either to help someone in trouble or brace for the worst. The woman was still face down on the pavement as he approached. When he turned her over, he staggered back immediately. It was hard to see clearly from the car, but we could tell something was wrong. Marcus started panicking and bolted back to the driver's seat. He floored it out of there. I only caught a glimpse of her as we sped past, but what I saw explained why he was so shaken. Her face was distorted. Her eyes bulged unnaturally, her jaw hung crooked, and her right arm was twisted behind her in a way that didn't even seem humanly possible. It was a sight I couldn't wrap my head around, something no one could do to another person, or so I thought. The only clue Marcus spotted that might explain it was a blue star spray-painted on the road next to her. We had no idea what it meant, or who put it there, but my family couldn't shake the feeling it was a symbol tied to some group of killers. I know that sounds insane, but can you blame us? It took us another 3 hours to reach the next town. When we finally got there, Marcus filed a police report, though we couldn't pinpoint exactly where it happened, just some road in the middle of nowhere. I'm not sure if the authorities did anything about it, but I like to think they opened an investigation. 2 months later, I was scrolling through Reddit, diving into posts about disappearances and wild theories. I've always been into mysteries, so I was skimming through this one thread packed with photos, videos, and speculation about why people might vanish. That's when I stumbled across something that hit me like a punch to the gut. A picture of a blue star. It was identical to the one I'd seen on the road that night. This time it was spray painted on a tree trunk. The post's caption said something like, "Found this symbol on a hiking trail." The thread was buzzing with replies, people tossing out theories about who might be behind it. Everything from the smiley face killers to cult sacrifices, even a comment suggesting it could be aliens. One idea that stuck out was that it might be the work of a group dubbed the Star Killers. All the theories made some kind of sense, but I wasn't about to dig deeper for the right answer. My family never got any updates on the case, and honestly, we didn't expect to. If anyone out there has more info about these so-called Star Killers, please let people know what you find.